Hey everybody, this is Rabbit, welcome back to the channel, and I have a bit of a confession to make. Out of all the mid-Cold War main battle tanks, my personal favorite has always been the French AMX-30. Something about it, the way it looks, just always really appealed to me, so naturally I had to grind through the French tech tree to grab the AMX-30s at the various battle ratings, but this did prompt a bit of a thought process for me because it turns out the AMX-30s have very weird matchmaking, as does a lot of the French 8.0 to 8.7. Also, as a minor disclaimer, this isn't complaining about the French 8.0 to 8.7, I actually do really like a lot of the vehicles, I enjoy playing with them, and I generally have good games in them. However, it's undeniable that the compression makes them very weird to play in a lot of respects. Now obviously the subject of this video will be decompression, but of course we have to know what compression is before we can really have that conversation. Compression occurs in War Thunder when vehicles of differing stats get put really close together in terms of battle rating and often end up having to fight each other, resulting in some fairly one-sided matches. To use a fairly extreme example to illustrate the point, if War Thunder went from having a 1.0 to 11.7 down to having 1.0 to 5.0, you would end up with some very weird matchmaking where Shermans are fighting Leopards and IS-2s are having to take on M1 Abrams, and obviously that would be pretty unfair for some parties. One thing that often gets overlooked in conversations about compression, however, is that compression is not symmetrical. Every battle rating is not affected equally by compression. 3.0 to 4.0 remains relatively compression free, with very few vehicles feeling like they fight things that they're just ultimately completely outclass them. On the other hand, some battle ratings, like specifically about 8.0 to 9.0, have such bad compression that you often run up to vehicles that you have basically no chance against. With all that being said, let's talk about some of the specifics so we can get a better idea of exactly how it affects the matchmaker. If you're playing the French 8.3 lineup and you get it maxed out here, you can reasonably expect to see vehicles like the American M47 and T32 and the Soviet IS-3. These are all late World War II, very early Cold War vehicles that have very little in terms of real technology, with the M47's rangefinder being about as good as you get, not a single stabilizer, laser rangefinder, thermal imaging device, or even so much as a dart in sight. And this is pretty standard for this battle rating. The only real air threats you have to worry about are basic CAS, with things like the F2H2 Banshee for USA and the Su-11 for Russia that just have a relatively small number of unguided bombs, and that's about it. 7.3 lineups don't even feature a single helicopter, as the lowest helicopter in the game is at 7.7. Now we flash forward to a max up tier with that exact same French 8.3 lineup, and now we're facing the early models of the T72 and T64, the MBT and KPZ-70, some late models of the Leopard 1, and of course my personal favorite, the XM1, which is somehow at 9.3. While not all of these vehicles have thermal imaging, with the Soviet tanks being the main ones lacking it, all of them do have stabilizers, laser rangefinders, and fairly powerful and very high velocity darts for nailing targets at basically any distance. Moving to the air threats, we start seeing a lot more ballistic computers enabling very precision drop of ordnance, but we also start seeing guided ordnance like the Bullpup missile featured on the American A4E, and we even get our first taste of the American AGM-65 Maverick fire and forget anti-tank missiles on the Israeli Ayet, which is basically uncounterable by gun-based CAS. On top of that, helicopters are showing up a lot more often with various guided missiles like TOW-2s, Hot-2s, and the Falanga for the Soviets. This is just a fairly ridiculous array of vehicles you can potentially fight at 8.3, ranging from early jets and World War II era vehicles firing essentially solid shot, all the way up to fully modern MBTs and attack helicopters and planes with guided missiles. So that's what compression is, but what is decompression? Well, decompression is where the battle rating ceiling is raised to a point where other battle ratings below it can be expanded out and potentially create a better matchmaker for the vehicles below it. Now, a lot of the discussion about compression and decompression tends to talk about decompression as though it's a catch-all solution, as though infinite decompression would basically always make the game better. But if we were to use a fairly absurd example and stretch the game out from not just 1.0 to 11.7, but 1.0 to 100.0, you would all of a sudden start to see the problem in that even though vehicles could theoretically find better niches, they would also have very narrow cross sections of enemies they could fight, and this would result in a very attenuated matchmaker where some vehicles just couldn't find matches at all, or others would spend forever trying to find a game. Obviously, both ends of this matchmaking spectrum are undesirable, but how exactly do you come up with a solution that keeps the vehicles relatively competitive amongst each other without attenuating it so much that it takes forever to find a game? This is probably a good time to go back to the France 8.3 example, and to an extent also France 8.7, because it provides us with a healthy view of what types of battle ratings can be very difficult to decompress, even if you were to theoretically give them enough battle ratings to play with. In France 8.3, you have the AMX-30 Accra, which has no stabilizer and nothing but a guided missile and doesn't even really have that much armor, although it does have good mobility. Then you have the AMX-10RC that has no stabilizer but has a dart, a laser rangefinder, and thermal imaging, making it very close but ever so slightly far from being a fully modern vehicle because the stabilizer does make a big difference at medium range. And then of course you have vehicles like the Mars 15 with fantastic mobility, a fast reload, a dart, and a laser rangefinder, but no thermal imaging, and of course no stabilizer. This shows the obvious problem in that a lot of vehicles in this BR range are essentially Frankenstein technology in that they have some elements of World War II but some elements of modern vehicles, and it's mixed and matched together to the point where there aren't exactly perfect analogies in a lot of areas. For example, the AMX-10RC in a max down tier is a practically unmatched sniper, as it can easily find opponents with the thermals and easily land shots with the laser rangefinder and the dart, and basically nothing in a match down tier can contest it on very large long-range maps, especially because it has the mobility to get to these spots very easily. Conversely, as soon as you go into the max up tier, the AMX-10RC is now very average because most vehicles can easily contest it at that distance, and with their stabilizers they can snap shots on fairly quickly if the AMX-10RC is even a little slow to respond. Then you have vehicles like the AMX-30 Accra that is wholly dependent on a guided missile to be effective, except that you can run into vehicles like the T-55 AMD-1 that have a hard kill system with a whopping 8 charges, so if you run into it from the front, you have basically no chance of ever beating a T-55 AMD-1 with an AMX-30 Accra. It's essentially impossible unless it just isn't paying attention to you. However, as soon as you go up to the next BR bracket of 8.7, you have the AMX-30 Brennus, which has both explosive reactive armor and an IRCM system to counter optically guided missiles, meaning it can effectively bully around vehicles like the tow vehicles and the IT-1 because they simply can't hurt it at basically any distance. That being said, the AMX-30 Brennus also lacks a stabilizer, so against fully modern tanks it will definitely struggle as they don't really care about the IRCM and to a large extent won't really care about the ERA either. While some of these vehicles could perhaps benefit from a minor battle rating adjustment, on the whole a lot of them are just going to be in situations where they're either incredibly good or incredibly awful, and that kind of binary relationship won't really go away unless you really narrow down what they can fight. It's also notable that while this channel generally covers ground RB, air RB has a similar problem with vehicles that don't have great flight performance like the Su-25 or A-10, but also have so much technology that you can't really put them at an appropriate battle rating for their flight performance. So with that understanding of the limitations of decompression, it's important to look at how you can realistically use it to try and improve gameplay experiences and the viability of certain vehicles. In my opinion and experience, the best decompression results that you can ever get are results where you're looking at a very specific or narrow cross-section of vehicles or battle ratings that you specifically want to improve the matchmaking of, instead of just decompressing in general, because just decompressing in general is a lot like playing a game of musical chairs in that you still end up with the same number of people that don't have a seat, they're just in slightly different places. To use a practical example, I frequently play with some of my friends who are at a lower battle rating than myself, and when I do, we often play around the 5.7 bracket because that's where some of them are in the American tech tree, and it becomes obvious very quickly that the American 5.7 lineup is a little outclassed because it constantly fights the German 6.7 lineup. We did an entire evening of games and I counted, and we never had a single down tier, and we only have one minor up tier that merely went to 6.3. This wouldn't be such an issue except for the fact that the King Tiger is frontally immune to the vast majority of American guns around this battle rating outside of the M36B2, and of course this led to some of my friends picking up the Sherman 75 Jumbo and being very disappointed at the very lackluster gun. While I have a pretty good record in the French Jumbo, it's undeniable that the Jumbo does have an abnormally high ceiling for a heavy tank where you basically just have to know where to shoot everybody, especially as the King Tigers can largely just click on the middle of the Jumbo and unless they catch a weird angle, will basically take it out from any distance. If you were to set out with a goal to prevent Shermans that are mostly armed with 75s and 76s from having to fight a King Tiger from the front in every match, this would be a fairly realistic goal to achieve, as you could move the top echelons slightly up, and then you could move other vehicles up to put a nice spacer between those two BR brackets. Decompression done with a specific goal that can be identified and measured can achieve positive success, although it won't achieve success across the entire battle rating spread, only for specific vehicles and lineups, but this is still better than nothing. I do personally find when you're dealing with the Frankenstein vehicles that you're probably just going to perpetually have a problem finding a good place for them, no matter how much you decompress the battle ratings, because they simply don't have enough vehicles that they are competitive with without absolutely destroying. This does also bring up another problem when talking about German 6.7, because the German 6.7 lineup is a black hole, much like the Russian 10.0 lineup. It tends to pull all of the matchmaking into it, both above and below it. This is another issue that's simply not solvable within the confines of decompression. You are always going to be pulled up into King Tigers if you are 1.0 or battle rating less below it, and I don't think this is ever going to be solved, especially when you have really popular lineups or really popular vehicles. The most you could realistically expect from a developer standpoint is to try to limit the number of vehicles that are exactly 1 BR below these lineups. That being said, I do somewhat appreciate the fact that they have concentrated a lot of the premium vehicles around specific BRs, so it doesn't mess up as much of the matchmaker as it could potentially, but it is still definitely an issue that has to be factored in when discussing decompression. At the end of the day, while decompression has its uses and applications to try and improve the gameplay experience, it's not a placebo that's going to solve a lot of problems at once. Instead, it is a very targeted solution that can solve very specific problems, and that's really about it. But of course, that's just my take on the issue. If you have any thoughts, please drop them in the comments down below. I always love to read it. As always, donk a bit to shoes.